Daniel Hale had been a caretaker for Lester's father, Mose Eubanks, in the years before he died. If the artwork came from this man, and not from Lester, it probably wouldn't yield any physical clues to Lester's whereabouts. But Seiler thought Daniel Hale could provide something just as valuable, a rare glimpse into the inner workings of the Eubanks family. After parking outside the perimeter fence, Seiler and his partner unholstered their weapons and placed them in a gun safe in the back of their car.
So we're dropped all our gear, about to walk into prison. I think this is going to be a good interview. I think we got a good shot of gathering some good information.
About 45 minutes later, Seiler and I met up in a parking lot.
He's very close to the family and had intimate relationships with people within the family. And, as we've learned throughout this investigation, it's very segregated. Mose was very secretive, and sometimes he didn't share, certain parts of his life with other people.
Seiler said Daniel clearly had a unique vantage point, spending long days with the Eubanks family patriarch near the end of his life. Seiler sensed Daniel had real insights into Mose and Mose's feelings for Lester.
He was close to all of his children and was embarrassed. He was embarrassed for what occurred.
But Seiler said Daniel remained guarded with what he would share. It was pretty apparent the jailhouse meeting had not gone as well as Seiler wanted.
It was a tough interview.
I wondered if we could learn more from the painter ourselves. So Alex Hosenball and I began reaching out to him, first with a letter, and then on a prison-approved email system. We waited eagerly for a response. The last time the marshals knew for sure where Lester Eubanks was living was in the 1990s, and that's right around the time Daniel Hale began to get close to Lester's father. But it was hard to tell. Was Daniel ever close enough to learn more? And if he did, would he feel a duty to remain silent? It took months, but eventually he wrote back. At first his notes were restrained, and then a thick envelope arrived this fall. So today we got a letter from Daniel Hale from the Allenwood Correctional Facility. We'll see what he has to say. Okay, it's very long. Daniel had begun to open up. In a 6-page letter, he started to share his story. So on the first page, he's basically describing Mose as a good guy who was looking out for him. He revealed that his mother had been close to Mose for 50 years, and that he spent more than a decade in close quarters with Mose inside the Eubanks family circle, and he was willing to talk to us. We began trying to arrange a call with Daniel, hoping he could lead us closer to Lester than ever before. As this new contact started to look more promising, our other new acquaintance, that man who suspected his mother had been raped by Lester, he was starting to hear back from the commercial labs that had analyzed his DNA. With the man's permission, I shared his results with an expert who knew how to dig for clues in genetic data. Her name is Cece Moore, and she's an ABC News contributor who works in a new field called investigative genealogy. I reached her in California.
It's a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack, but it's definitely worth trying it because his children and or grandchildren would likely not have any idea about his past, and so it's very possible they might test at one of the consumer DNA testing companies, not realizing that that could potentially lead to his identification.
A few weeks later, she called me. So obviously I'm dying to know, what did you find in there? Was there anything useful at all?
Well, yes and no. It's not going to lead us to Lester immediately, unfortunately. But I can definitely confirm that the person's DNA that you tested is indeed the son of Lester Eubanks. So if there was any doubt about that, that is dispelled.
Among the close matches she found, Clarence Eubanks, Lester's brother. One of the companies identified him as the man's uncle. And she found 2 other, more distant matches.
One of them does trace back to the Eubanks family, so it again reconfirms that you are indeed testing a child of Lester's.
And that, she said, is a very promising development.
What that means for us is that this DNA is very valuable for fishing in these databases. New matches come in every day across the 4 databases that you have as DNA, and that means at any time, any day, a new match could pop up that could help lead to Lester, or at least lead to some more information about where he's been all of these years. They are constantly updated, and there are many, many people testing across the country, or even across the world, every day, that are getting these kids, spitting in that tube and mailing it into the companies.
When I started looking at this case, I thought DNA could hold the key to finding Lester. I had read all the stories about the Golden State Killer, the serial murderer who hid in plain sight for years, only to be tracked down when a relative entered their DNA into a commercial genealogy site. But for us, it was clear that DNA wasn't going to deliver that aha moment. Yes, the genetic profile of Lester's son could be useful, but only if someone else stepped forward. Someone, perhaps, who was fathered by a drifter, a man who popped into their life and then disappeared. I was just thinking, and I'm a little curious about this, if somebody is listening to this story, hearing this podcast, and they think that their grandfather or their father or their uncle who was in their life looks a lot like Lester Eubanks, and that person has moved on and is not part of their life anymore, what can they do to get that answer?
Well, they can order a DNA test from any of the consumer DNA testing companies. You have this DNA fishing in there, and all 4 of them. And if they do that, it will come up as a match.
I was even more surprised to discover, just in the past few weeks, that DNA also has limitations for the U.S. Marshals. Seiler did not share with me the work he's doing with DNA, but I assumed that he would, right away, try and match samples from Lester's son to those sitting right now in a nationwide database of evidence from unsolved rape and murder cases. But I began speaking with experts about how this would work and discovered there are strict laws surrounding DNA, unbending rules that actually forbid authorities from entering the DNA of a criminal's relative into the national database to try and solve a crime. As legal experts explained it to me, these are complicated questions with legitimate privacy concerns at play. But for Lester, it was all starting to look like one more lucky break. Still, with or without his DNA, Lester Eubanks' son had already helped the investigation in another important way. Seiler added his photo to a stack of family pictures he had gathered, and this fall he submitted them to a forensic artist from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The center's artists are known for their remarkable ability to take photos of infants or toddlers who had gone missing and project what they would look like years, even decades later. They took this on as a special project for the Marshals. The artist in charge of updating Lester's photo was Paloma Galzi. She relied on old photos of Lester, and recent ones of relatives, as guideposts for an age progression that could give people an idea of what Lester looks like today.
So he looks a lot like his dad from the pictures that I've got, and he's got like this huge, massive chin that is very interesting to reproduce and to make sure that it's on the image.
It would take her about 8 hours. As she worked, I asked her what she was thinking.
It's stressful. It's stressful
really
for
cool.
me because I'm hoping I'm going to do a good job.
Yeah.
I was like, all right.
The result is what led to the image on the cover of this podcast, and you can see how she made it in a video on our website. Really, it looks like a photograph. Lester today. The image would become the centerpiece of the manhunt, and within hours, it was on wanted posters nationwide. When the U.S. Marshals first began this manhunt, it had been more than 2 decades since the last known sighting of Lester Eubanks. But the Marshals would soon be in a better position than ever to start closing that gap considerably. This became clear on a recent afternoon when I answered a call from Allenwood Federal Prison.
You have a prepaid call. You will not be charged for this call. This call is from
Daniel Hale,
an inmate at a federal prison.
It was the painter, Daniel Hale, the man whose artwork we had seen on the living room wall of the civil rights lawyer and minister, James Banks. Daniel was in the middle of serving a 36-month sentence on a weapons charge. Before we start, I just wondered if you could describe where you are right now, what it looks like from where you're, I don't know if you're seated or standing or...
Oh, standing at a phone booth, and there's only like one during the work hours that works for 150 guys.
So what do you see from the phone booth?
Let's see, a card room, a TV room, let's see, people over on computers. I can see other buildings and through the bars, obviously.
Daniel was being held in a minimum security facility, but perhaps a sign of how much has changed since the days when Lester Eubanks took that shopping trip. Daniel had been delayed in talking with us because the corrections officers were conducting another inmate count.
They have them every few hours here. They're sticklers about counting people.
I asked Daniel about that painting, the one that brought us to him in the first place. Do you remember how that all came about?
Yeah, actually, it was Mose Eubanks, the Reverend there, that commissioned the painting. For some reason, he said it was their anniversary, so he wanted it done for them, and I spent maybe a month or something on it, and then he presented it to them at Sunday's church one day.
Most members of the Eubanks family that we reached over the course of reporting this story remain deeply guarded. They would not talk about Lester. But both Daniel and he told us his mother had gained the trust of the family. Daniel was with Mose constantly in the last decade of his life. I wondered if Mose ever put paintings by Lester on display in his home.
Oh, he absolutely did. Lester's name was on it. He had 2 of them in that living room. They were both some sort of religious motif. I don't know if he did them on a prison.
He said it was his mother who first heard Mose open up about Lester.
She said he let the cat out of the bag.
He said his mother knew Mose was not only communicating with Lester, but was helping support him financially. Do you think that Mose turned to her for some help in how to move money to Lester, or she just picked up on the fact that he was doing that?
No, she said for a fact he was doing it.
He described how he used to bring Mose to a bank in central Mansfield and told us he suspected Mose was somehow sending money to his son, though he could never be sure. That was surprising enough. But then Daniel told us Mose attended a 2011 Eubanks family reunion, and Lester was there.
He had gotten to see his son after so many years.